The musicians of the 60s have always been a subject of fascination. The Beatles were one of those bands who were matchless in their talent and were liked by people of all ages, especially the youth. The charm of the Beatles was consistent, but there were some bands from the United States that rivaled the Beatles in popularity and talent. These bands might not be as good as the Beatles, but they competed favorably with the English band. The Beach Boys were no doubt one of the greatest rivals of the Beatles in the 60s. The Beach Boys released some fantastic albums that competed with the tracks of the Beatles and left an impact on the people. Today, we are going to see how the Beach Boys competed with the Beatles and became their most prominent American rivals. But before we start, subscribe to my channel below if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon to get all the notifications of my uploads. Now, before we talk about the rivalry between the two bands, let's talk about the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were an American rock band of the 1960s that consisted of the original members Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Michael Love, and Alan Jardine. The later significant members included David Marks and Bruce Johnston. The band used the music of older pop vocal groups, 1950s rock and roll, and black R&B to create their unique sound. They also added classical or jazz elements and unconventional recording techniques in innovative ways under the instructions of Brian Wilson. The Pet Sounds album and Good Vibrations were the band's singles that earned them respect as rock innovators. The Beach Boys are one of the most commercially successful bands of all time, selling over 100 million records worldwide. Between the 1960s and 2010s, the group had 36 songs reach the US Top 40, with 4 topping the Billboard Hot 100. In 2004, they were ranked number 12 on Rolling Stone's list of the greatest artists of all time. The band fell apart with the death of Carl Wilson, who was the diplomatic glue holding everyone together. Michael Love separated and formed his solo band called the Endless Summer Band, while Alan Jardine led a band made up of the Beach Boys' backing band, plus his son and the daughters of Brian Wilson. Their band was called the Beach Boys Family and Friends. The competition between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. The rivalry between the Beatles and the Stones, which was a superficial competition created by media, real creative competition existed between the Beach Boys and the Beatles. They were friends in real life and influenced each other's music. Their competition was not invented by the press, but it came from their creativity and talent. In fact, the Beatles' Rubber Soul inspired Brian Wilson to write Pet Sounds, which in turn was a massive influence on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and its pre-release, non-album single Strawberry Fields Forever, the song that caused Brian to abandon his storied Smile album, claiming the Beatles had already achieved what Smile had set out to do. Rock music was progressing very quickly in the 60s because these two bands were trying to outshine each other with every new release. The competition resulted in some of the best music pieces that the world still cherishes. Although the rivalry between the two bands was at its peak in 1964 and 1967, the competition existed throughout the 60s. The start of the rivalry leads back to 1962, when the Beatles released their first single and the Beach Boys released their first album. It ended in 1970 with the release of the final Beatles album. 1962, the beginning. In 1960, the rock genre was slowly losing its charm. The deaths of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, the arrest of Chuck Berry, and the retirement of Little Richard left the future of rock bleak. But then, many new bands started emerging, including the Beatles and the Beach Boys, which gave a new direction to rock music. The Beach Boys were winning hearts in California with their surf music, while in Liverpool, the Beatles were reshaping the rock genre. The Beach Boys achieved local success with their debut single, Surfin', in 1961, which followed their debut album, Surfin' Safari, and its even more popular title track in 1962. The same year, the Beatles put on their debut single, Love Me Do, which was an instant local hit for them. 1963 was the year the Beatles released their first 2 albums, Please Please Me and With the Beatles, and at the same time, 3 new Beach Boy albums, Surfin' USA, Surfer Girl, and Little Deuce Coupe were released. The race to pop stardom was born after the successful releases by both bands in 1963. 1963 to 1965. In the later years, the Beatles and the Beach Boys pushed the boundaries of pop music in a thrillingly innovative way. They perfected the art of writing pop songs. Before they fell into the cycle of drugs, they were producing pop music in its purest and most refined form. The songs of both the bands were short and simple, but they were enough to win over the hearts of 1960s teenagers and remain impactful on every generation that followed. Catch a Wave for the Beach Boys was the song that found Brian breaking away from Chuck Berry's worship and beginning to toy with the unexpected chord changes that led to his most innovative songs. Most important Beach Boys song from 1963 was In My Room. In the same year, the Beatles took steps toward pop innovation with their second album. 1964 was when the competition between the two bands was really on. The Beatles scored their first #1 hit in the US on February 1st, 1964 with I Want to Hold Your Hand, making Brian Wilson angry. He said, "I flipped. It was like a shock went through my system." At the same time, Brian was growing tired of the sounds of the Beach Boys and wanted to push them forward and stay interesting and relevant. Brian recruited Spector's Wrecking Crew members and recorded I Get Around with them. 3 months after, I Want to Hold Your Hand topped the US charts, and I Get Around became the Beach Boys' first #1 hit. Both the bands somehow got involved with drugs in 1964, which impacted their songwriting. There was nothing the Beatles and the Beach Boys released in 1964 that proved to be as monumental as Pet Sounds or Rubber Soul or Revolver. Then came the Beach Boys' answer to the Beatles for sale in the form of Today. The albums arrived 3 months apart, and they were the first since each band started smoking pot. Both albums came after a period of exhaustion for the creators, resulting in a more somber tone and marking a drastic departure from each band's early hits. In the summer of 1965, the Beach Boys and the Beatles each released new albums a month apart from each other. Summer Days and Summer Nights and Help. It was the period when the band seemed stuck between who they were and who they were hoping to become. During the same year, both bands got hooked up to LSD. The bands released some of the most popular songs during the period, and their songs served as motivation for each other. By the end of 1965, the Beatles released Rubber Soul, and everything changed. It was the first time that the Beatles, or any pop band, treated the album as one grand statement, not just a collection of songs. And these songs were a seamless fusion of folk, rock, jangle pop, psychedelia, and more without a trace of bubblegum. The competition onwards. The Beatles listened closely to the Beach Boys when they wrote Rubber Soul, and Brian Wilson listened right back. Rubber Soul is probably the greatest record ever, according to Brian Wilson. It wasn't just the lyrics and the melodies, but the production and their harmonies. It was almost art music. Trying to come up with something better than Rubber Soul, Brian came up with God Only Knows, which became the favorite song of McCartney. But Brian wanted to make something that would make a statement just like the Beatles. Meanwhile, the Beatles came up with some of their most amazing songs, including Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, etc. Brian gave up on some of his bright ideas after 1966, but the Beatles kept going on. In 1967, the only thing the Beach Boys had to show was Smiley Smile, a scrappy home-recorded album that included raw, stripped-down versions of songs from the Smile sessions. It was a total commercial failure. Mike Love was criticizing the direction Brian's songwriting was going in. Capitol Records was pressuring the band to finish the album before Brian thought it was ready, while Brian's mental health issues were growing. He was feeling defeated by Strawberry Fields Forever. Due to all these factors, Smile was abandoned, and Brian never attempted something that ambitious again. When Brian stepped back from his role as the band's mastermind, the band kind of lost its spark, but the Beatles kept moving forward. Abbey Road proved to be a masterclass innovation for the Beatles. It was the last true Beatles album, but the actual last album was Let It Be, and it was largely recorded around the same time as Abbey Road. The band ultimately broke up in the 1970s. Meanwhile, the Beach Boys were rejuvenated in 1970. They released one of their best post-Pet Sounds album with Sunflower, with some great, fresh, new, Brian Wilson written or co-written songs. The end was that all four Beatles went on to have solo careers, and the Beach Boys kept recording records. The Beach Boys' career kept ebbing and flowing for decades. Brian got some reputation for Smile in 2004 when he finally re-recorded it and released it as a solo album and performed it in full with Paul McCartney and George Martin in attendance. The two bands made the 60s one of the most glorious eras for rock music. With this, our video comes to an end. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and tell me in the comment section below which of these two bands you like the most. I will see you guys with another video. See you next time.